She took another woman's place at the altar and paid the price for that lie. She wore another woman's dress. That was the part that stayed with her longest, even after everything else that followed, even after the deception unraveled and the truth came out, and the price of the lie was paid in full with interest, even after the dust settled on all of it, and she was standing on the other side of the wreckage looking at what remained. It was the dress she kept coming back to. White cotton with small pearl buttons down the back and a hem that had been let out 2 inches because the woman it had been made for was taller. And Ruth had stood in front of a mirror in a borrowed room in a town she had never been to before and looked at herself in that dress and thought, this is the moment you can still turn back. She had not turned back. She had walked down the steps of that rooming house and across the dusty main street of Hollers Creek, Wyoming, and into the small courthouse where a man she had never met was waiting to marry a woman he had also never met, and she had become someone else for the space of a signature and a promise. She had not understood then what that promise was going to cost her. She had not understood then what it was going to give her either. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Stay with me, because this story does not move fast. It moves the way the best and most important things move, with weight and intention, and every step it takes it earns. And by the time it is finished, you're going to feel something deep and quiet that needed to be felt. If stories like this one are what bring you here, slow emotional Western romance with real stakes and real consequences, and love that has to find its way through darkness before it reaches a light, then please subscribe before this one ends. There are so many more waiting for you. Now, let's go back to where it started. Her name was Delia Hart, and she was 27 years old, and she had been making difficult decisions under pressure for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to make a decision from a place of ease. She had grown up in a small town in Nebraska, the eldest of 4 children, with a father who drank more than was good for anyone, and a mother who compensated for that by being the steadiest woman Delia had ever known, the kind of woman who held a household together through the specific grace of never letting anyone see the seams. Delia had inherited her mother's steadiness and her father's tendency to make decisions that looked reckless from the outside, but made complete sense from inside, if you understood all the factors involved. The factor that mattered most in this particular decision was a girl named Lottie. Lottie was 14 years old, and she was Delia's youngest sister, and she was sick. Not the kind of sick that passes. The kind that requires a doctor's ongoing attention and medicine that costs more than a seamstress in Nebraska earns in 2 months, and the kind of care that cannot be provided in a house where the father is unreliable and the mother is already stretched to her last thread. Delia had been managing it for 2 years, working 2 jobs, sending money home, making the arithmetic work through sheer force of will and creative accounting, and the willingness to go without things she needed herself. And then she had met Cecily Vance. Cecily was 23 and beautiful in the uncomplicated way of someone who had never had to work very hard for anything, and she had gotten herself into a situation that her beauty could not resolve. She had answered a mail-order bride advertisement from a rancher in Wyoming named Cole Harding and had exchanged several letters with him, and had allowed the arrangement to proceed to the point of signed agreement and a train ticket and a wedding date. And then she had fallen desperately and completely in love with a banker's son in Omaha and had decided she could not go through with it. The problem was the contract. Cole Harding had sent a significant sum of money in advance, the kind of arrangement that some agencies facilitated, and Cecily had spent a portion of it on the dress and the travel preparations and a few other things that a woman of Cecily's nature spent money on without thinking too carefully about the future, and she did not have enough left to repay it. She needed someone to go in her place. She had come to Delia with this proposal because Delia had a reputation for being practical, and because Cecily was the kind of person who could identify practicality in others and harness it for her own purposes without much guilt about the process. She had also come with money, enough money to cover Lottie's medicine for 8 months, and a good portion of the doctor's bills. Delia had said no. She had said no twice. The 3rd time Cecily came to her, she brought the doctor's latest report on Lottie, and Delia had looked at the numbers on that page, and the no had died somewhere between her mouth and the air, and she had said, very quietly, what exactly would I have to do? Cecily's plan was straightforward in the way that bad plans always seem straightforward before you are inside them. Delia would travel to Hollers Creek under Cecily's name. She would marry Cole Harding as Cecily Vance. She would have 1 month to assess the situation. and if it was intolerable, she would find a way to end the arrangement and return, and Cecily would deal with the legal consequences from a safe distance. And if it was not intolerable. Cecily had not finished that sentence. She had left it open in the way that people leave things open when they do not want to examine the end of them. Delia had not pressed. She had packed her bag and put on the dress and gotten on the train. She arrived in Hollers Creek on a Wednesday morning in September, when the air was sharp with the first suggestion of autumn, and the sky was a particular deep blue that belongs to high country mornings. The town was modest and clean and surrounded on three sides by ranch land that rolled out toward mountains. She could see clearly from the station platform. She stood with her one bag and Cecily's name and tried to feel certain about what she was doing. She did not feel certain, but she had Lottie's doctor's report in her coat pocket like a reason, and she held on to that. He was waiting. Cole Harding was 36 years old and taller than she had imagined, with a rangy, lean build and a face that had been made angular by outdoor work and by something else she could not immediately name, something internal, a weathering from the inside as much as from the outside. His hair was a dark reddish-brown, and his eyes were a hazel that shifted between green and brown depending on the light, and they looked at her when she came off the platform with a directness that made her want to be honest with him immediately. She was not honest with him immediately. She said, "Mr. Harding." He said, "Miss Vance." She felt the name land wrong, the way things land when they are not yours. He shook her hand. His grip was brief and firm, and he looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he looked away and picked up her bag. He said, "The justice of the peace is ready when you are, unless you need time first." She thought about Lottie. She said, "I am ready." The ceremony took 11 minutes. She said the words. He said the words. The justice of the peace said the words that go in between. She signed the name Cecily Vance in handwriting that was not quite hers because it was not quite her name, and she felt the weight of that signature like something physical settling on her shoulders. Cole signed beside it without looking at her. Afterward, they walked out into the September morning as married strangers, and he put her bag in a wagon and helped her up without ceremony, and they drove the 8 miles out to the Harding Ranch in a silence that had a particular texture, the texture of two people who had just done something irrevocable and are separately processing what that means. The ranch was larger than she had expected. The house was well built and solid with a wide porch and a yard that had been recently swept and windows that were clean, the kind of clean that takes effort, and she thought, he prepared for this. He made the house ready for someone he had never met. That told her something. There was a boy on the porch. He was 8 years old with his father's reddish-brown hair and a spray of freckles across his nose and eyes that were entirely his own, a clear light brown that looked at the world with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to be suspicious of new things. He said, "Are you the lady from the letters?" Delia said, "Yes." He said, "I am Eli. I already ate lunch, but Mrs. Garner left soup on the stove if you are hungry." Cole said, "Lie." Eli said, "What?" She might be hungry. It was a long trip. Delia said, "It was?" "And soup sounds very good. Thank you, Eli." Eli nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose practical thinking has been validated and went back inside. Cole watched the sun go, and the expression on his face was the first unguarded thing she had seen from him. Something warm and tired and deeply loving all at once. She thought, he is a good father. And she thought, this is already more complicated than Cecily made it sound. The first days were careful. Cole was respectful in a way that kept its distance, not coldly, but with a correctness that suggested he was not a man who presumed anything about a woman he did not yet know. He had given her a bedroom of her own. He had shown her the house and the kitchen, and where everything was kept, and had said that she should make whatever changes she saw fit, and that Mrs. Garner came 3 days a week to help with the heavy work. Delia managed the house and learned the rhythm of the ranch and talked with Eli, who had opinions about everything and shared them freely. And she worked at being useful, because being useful was the only thing that made her feel like the weight she was carrying was balanced by something. She was carrying a great deal. Every morning she woke up, and she was Cecily Vance. She answered to that name across the breakfast table and in town, and in every conversation with every person in Hollers Creek. And every time she answered to it, something in her chest pulled tight with a discomfort she could not resolve because she had made her choice and she was living inside it. She wrote to Cecily once. A careful letter with nothing incriminating in it. She asked how Lottie was. She asked if the money had reached her mother. Cecily wrote back 3 weeks later with news that Lottie was better, and the medicine was working, and that everything at home was fine. And also, by the way, she was engaged to the banker's son, and would be married by Christmas. Delia read that letter and felt something that was not quite bitterness and not quite grief. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a person who has made a sacrifice for someone who is not going to spend very long being grateful for it. She burned the letter. Cole noticed things. She began to understand this about him gradually. The way you understand things about quiet people, through accumulation rather than announcement. He noticed when she was tired. He noticed when something was bothering her, even when she was being careful about her face. He noticed that she used her left hand for some tasks and her right hand for others in a way that suggested some kind of old injury. And one evening, he simply left a different style of kitchen knife on her side of the worktop, without saying anything about it, a lighter one with a better grip, and she had stood there looking at it for a moment with a feeling she could not afford to examine too closely. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a transaction. She had expected a man who wanted a housekeeper and a mother for his son, and had chosen the most efficient means of acquiring both. She had expected to feel like a practical solution to a practical problem. She did not feel that way. She felt, increasingly and alarmingly, like a person he was genuinely curious about, like someone he was paying attention to not because she was useful, but because he found her worth paying attention to, and that was a different thing entirely, and a much more dangerous one given the specific circumstances of who she was pretending to be. The trouble came from 2 directions at once. The first direction was a woman named Agnes Pryor. Agnes was the wife of the largest landowner in the county, and she had lived in Hollers Creek her entire life, and she knew everyone's business, and she had a particular gift for finding the edges of things and pressing on them to see what gave. She came to call on Delia in the 3rd week, very correct and very welcoming on the surface, with a plate of molasses cookies, and a set of eyes that took inventory of everything in the room. Over tea, she said, with a smile that was doing a great deal of work, "Your letters to Cole were just lovely. He shared one with my husband. They're old friends, and I remember thinking what a fine hand you had." Delia said carefully, "That is very kind." Agnes said, "You must write to me sometime. I do love a good letter." It was a test. Delia understood that immediately. Agnes wanted a sample of her handwriting to compare to the letters Cecily had written. She said, "I am afraid I have been suffering with a stiffness in my writing hand since the journey. Perhaps when it improves." Agnes smiled with all her teeth. She said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." After Agnes left, Delia sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The second direction was worse. A letter arrived from Cecily. This one was not careful. Cecily, flushed with the happiness of her engagement and particular carelessness that happiness sometimes produces in people who have not earned it carefully, wrote a letter that mentioned Delia by her real name twice and referenced the arrangement they had made with enough specificity that anyone reading it who knew anything would understand exactly what had happened. Delia read it standing at the kitchen counter. She read it twice. Then she heard Cole's boots on the porch, and she folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and turned to the stove, and her hands were completely steady, which she noticed distantly, the way you notice things about yourself when the rest of your mind is occupied with the specific terror of everything coming undone. That evening after Eli was in bed, Cole came into the kitchen where she was sitting with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, and he sat down across from her, and he said, in an even, quiet voice that was simply how he spoke, "Agnes Pryor came to see me today." Delia looked at him. He said, "She had some things to say." She said, "What kind of things?" He said, "The kind that come from a woman who has been asking questions she was not asked to ask." She spoke to the agency in Chicago. They told her that a woman named Cecily Vance had registered and had come to them with certain paperwork, and that the photograph they had on file did not match the woman she had met at my table. The room was very quiet. Delia said, "Cole," he said, "I want you to tell me the truth. All of it, from the beginning." And she did. She told him everything. Cecily and the contract and the money and Lottie and the dress that had been let out 2 inches at the hem and the name she had signed in handwriting that was not quite hers. She told him all of it in a level voice because she had decided in the 30 seconds between his first word and hers that she was finished carrying this particular weight alone, and that whatever happened after the truth was out was better than another day inside the lie. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. She said, "I understand if you want me to leave. I will not fight that. What I did was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I did it. And I did it anyway because my sister was sick and I was desperate. And those are reasons, but they are not excuses." He said, "What is your name?" She said, "Delia Hart." He said it quietly to himself, just once, like he was checking the fit of it. He said, "How old is your sister?" She said, 14. He said, "Is she improving?" She said, "The last letter said she was." He was quiet again. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting for ground to fall away under her for weeks, and now that it finally had, she felt almost calm. The way people feel calm when the thing they've been dreading arrives and turns out to be survivable. He said, "I have a question and I want an honest answer." She said, "Yes." He said, "In the time you have been here, in this house, with Eli, have you been yourself or have you been performing something?" She looked at him. She said, "I have been myself. Cecily's name, but everything else mine." He said, "That is what I thought." A pause. He said, "Eli asked me last week if you were going to stay forever. He has not asked that about anyone before." She felt that land in her chest like something warm and painful at the same time. He said, "I am not going to pretend that what you did was something other than what it was. It was a serious deception, and it is going to have consequences that we're going to have to manage carefully and legally, and I need you to be honest with me through all of it." She said, "I will be." He said, "But I am also not going to pretend that I do not know who has been sitting at my table and raising my son's spirits and making this house feel like something it has not felt like in a very long time." She said very quietly, "What has it felt like?" He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and he said, "Like somewhere worth coming home to." The legal matter took 6 weeks to resolve. Cole's lawyer in Cheyenne was methodical and thorough, and the agency in Chicago, when presented with the full circumstances, including the financial coercion Cecily had applied and the medical necessity that had driven Delia's decision, agreed to a renegotiation of the contract under the real name of the party present. Agnes Pryor told everyone in Hollers Creek what she had found out. Of course she did. And Hollers Creek, being a small town with a long memory and a complicated relationship with its own business, talked about it for 3 solid weeks, and then slowly, the way small towns slowly do when they have exhausted a subject and are forced to look at the actual human beings involved, began to come to its own conclusions. The conclusions were assisted by the visible evidence of a man and a woman, and a boy who had settled into a life together with a naturalness that was difficult to argue with. Mrs. Garner, who had worked for Cole for 4 years and was therefore the person whose opinion mattered most of the town's general assessment, said publicly in the dry goods store that she had never seen Cole Harding look more like himself than he did these days, and that whatever particulars of the arrangement, the result was a woman who was good for that household, and a boy who had started laughing regularly for the first time since his mother had left, and that as far as she was. Concerned the rest was paperwork. That settled most of it. There was a morning in November when the first snow came down over the valley, and Eli was at school and Cole and Delia were on the porch watching it together. The particular silence of first snow around them, and he said without looking at her, "I want to do this again." She said, "Do what again?" He said, "Marry you, the right way. Your name on the paper this time." She looked at him. He turned and looked back at her, and his face was entirely open, the way it was sometimes when he stopped being careful, and she thought, "There it is. There's the whole of him." She said, "Cole." He waited. She said, "I came here in another woman's dress with another woman's name, and I told myself it was for Lottie, and it truly was. But I think there was also a part of me that was so tired of my own life that I was willing to step into someone else's just to get a breath of air." He said, "And?" She said, "And I have been breathing ever since I got here. Real air, my own air, for the first time in a very long time." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "It is very much a yes." The snow came down over the Harding Ranch and over the mountain behind it, and Eli came home from school at 4 o'clock and stamped the snow off his boots on the porch and looked at his father's face and then at Delia's face and said, with the particular accuracy of an 8-year-old who's been paying close attention, "Did something good happen?" Cole looked at Delia. Delia looked at Cole. Cole said, "Yes, something good happened." Eli considered this. He said, "Is Delia staying forever now?" Cole said, "That is the plan." Eli nodded, as though this confirmed something he had worked out some time ago and had simply been waiting for the adults to catch up to. He said, "Good. I told Billy Pryor she was going to stay, and he said, probably not. And I said, definitely yes, and now I am right." He went inside. Delia laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from a place that has been waiting to laugh for a long time, and Cole's whole face changed with it, softened and opened, and became for a moment just a man standing in the snow on his own porch watching the woman beside him laugh, and thinking that whatever complicated and unlikely road had brought her here, he was grateful for every step of it. Delia thought about the dress. White cotton with small pearl buttons and a hem let out 2 inches. She thought about standing in front of that mirror in a borrowed room and thinking, this is the moment you can still turn back. She had not turned back, and she thought, with a certainty that went all the way down to the ground, that not turning back was the truest and best decision she had ever made in a life full of decisions made under pressure, because this difficult, dishonest, desperate leap into someone else's life, had somehow landed her squarely and completely in her own. The dress had been another woman's, but everything that came after was entirely hers. If this story reached you tonight, if something in it felt like it was meant for you to hear, please leave me a comment and tell me what part stayed with you the longest. And tell me where in the world you are watching from. Every person who finds their way to these stories is here for a reason, and I am grateful for every one of you. If you have not subscribed yet, please do that right now. There are so many more stories here about women who made hard choices and found their way to something real and lasting on the other side of them. Every single story is waiting for you. I will see you in the next one.